I'm Michael Fullylove, the Director of the Global Issues Program here, and welcome to today's talk on the new multilateralism of climate change. We're in a weird political and global situation, I think, on this issue at the moment. We've witnessed an institutional failure, or at least I would categorise it as such. John may be milder, where the UN institutions that were set up to deal with these issues have not delivered the outcome that anybody wanted. At the same time, there's been a political shift where, partly in response to that institutional failure, a lot of people have thrown their hands up and said, look, it's all too difficult in countries as, you know, from the United States to Australia and elsewhere. At the same time, you've got a really increased media scrutiny on the science of climate change and a very vocal and aggressive cohort of commentators on the right who are denying a lot of the climate science. And this has produced, I think, a sort of a moment of stasis where we're not really going anywhere. And yet, the really terrifying thing is that when you talk to the climate scientists, of course, they haven't changed their mind 1 nanosecond. And so the underlying science remains, its integrity remains, and the problem and the threat in the long term remains exactly as it always was. So that raises the question, where do we go now in light of these failures and in light of this new circumstance? What is the new multilateralism of climate change? To what extent will the old institutions play the role they need to, and what are the new institutions and the new alignments of interests and forces that might deliver change, policy change in response to climate change? And today I'm delighted that we're joined by a terrific speaker on this topic, John Connor. John and I have been colleagues for a long time. When I was at university, one of my jobs was working at an organisation called the Lawyers Reform Association, and John, I think, at that time was on the board of the Lawyers Reform Association. He's had a stellar career. He's a lawyer by training, but he's done a lot of interesting non-legal jobs, if I can put it that way. He's worked at the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales, the Australian Conservation Foundation, World Vision. He was a staffer to an independent MP. He is somebody who knows both the science and the politics and the policy of this inside out. So can I welcome, please, John Connor, the CEO of the Climate Institute. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for coming here today. I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the place where we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge in particular 2 staffers at the Climate Institute who can't be here today, Erwin Jackson, Deputy CEO, and Will McGoldrick, who's Manager of Policy, both of whom have helped very much in this paper today, but also our work on climate policy and diplomacy. First, to introduce us, the Climate Institute, we're a non-partisan independent research organisation. We're dedicated to working with business, community and the government to deliver effective climate solutions. Our vision is for an Australia leading the world in the deployment of low-carbon technology, policy, business practice and diplomacy. The Climate Institute recognises this is a global problem that requires a global solution, and as such we've got a focus on both on Australia's climate diplomacy as well as its domestic policies. Our focus for Australia has been on achieving a double dividend. We aspire to an Australia that's both competitive in the emerging global clean energy economy and cooperative in achieving effective global climate agreements. In the aftermath of Copenhagen, one of the ironies, in fact, is that the competitive reflexes appear to be outgunning the cooperative instincts as we race for a global low-carbon political economy. More on both later. But of course, Copenhagen capped off a disappointing month in terms of diplomacy and the domestic debate. For a brief 24 hours, there was bipartisan support for the emissions trading scheme embodied in the Turnbull-Rudd Agreement on the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, the CPRS. The Climate Institute supported that agreement, not because it was the ideal scheme for reducing our climate pollution and encouraging investment in low-carbon technologies. It wasn't. But it did provide the foundations of an effective, long, loud and legal price signal a sound architecture and mechanisms to wind back or time limit what we did see as excessive transitional compensation to coal-fired generators and big polluting exporters. Contrary to popular perceptions, this was not a permanent handout machine for the big polluters. It required all of our biggest polluters to pay a price on carbon pollution. In our view, and those of others like Professor Garneau, of course, it handed too much back and didn't allow enough for low clean technology investment support or to assisting our developing country neighbours get on a lower carbon development pathway. But in the medium to long term, though, the scheme retained its potential to drive investment in clean technology and place an actual limit on overall climate pollution and bring it down over time in a predictable, transparent way. No other scheme can do that, not carbon taxes, not emissions intensity schemes, nor direct action schemes led by taxpayer-funded incentives. In our view, it provided the mechanism to reach the credible target of a 25% reduction off 2000 levels of Australia's climate pollution by 2020, and the much deeper reductions that we need beyond then by 2050, at least 90%, and in our view, indeed, we should be carbon neutral by then. But we also supported the CPRS because it carried a rare but precious premium of bipartisan support. It offered the potential for a historic settlement for action akin to those in Australia's political history, like that on Medicare. It was a settlement that offered a springboard for improvement, a settlement that took us out of the trenches of cultural and ideological warfare, seemingly so comfortable to many on the left and the right. Sadly, it was a settlement, of course, that shattered 24 hours later with consequences that were both obvious and are still emerging. Regardless, we moved on to Copenhagen. Now, we had hoped there that past experiences of meetings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, if I may say so in future, like the dramas of Berlin, Kyoto and Bali before it, would have us at least falling across the line at the end of the meeting with the foundations of a new, fair, ambitious and legally binding post-2012 treaty. As Hugo Chavez said at Copenhagen, if climate change was a bank, it would have been saved already. Surely with all these world leaders at Copenhagen, it was too big to fail. But history didn't work out that way. Today I want to make three main points. Copenhagen didn't go backwards. Now, it didn't go forward as much as we would have liked, as much as was hyped, or even indeed hoped. But it didn't go backwards, primarily because of crucial misunderstandings and new developments in climate geopolitical factions. Secondly, we need a glass-half-full approach to the Accord and climate negotiations, not just because it's the only one we've got, but also because there have been significant developments before and after Copenhagen. Filling the rest of that glass, finally, requires fast start finance commitments made in Copenhagen to be honoured. It requires a new approach to climate multilateralism, its forums and its factions, and even more important than ever, credible domestic policies. At the core of the challenge of the new climate realpolitik, the new climate multilateralism, are two questions. Is an all-embracing, legally binding treaty possible or indeed required to drive the much stronger action and investment we need? And secondly, will Australia and others be creative and committed enough amongst souring domestic politics to play a constructive role? Or will Australia drift back to old factions, a narrow focus, and even worse, back to being a millstone on climate negotiations? Only time will tell what the answers to some of those questions are, but we can start to make the journey forward from Copenhagen towards a more ambitious cooperation between nations. But let me start with some reflections on the meeting itself. I arrived some 2 days into the 2 week-long talks. I arrived after the release of ads showing a young girl threatened sequentially by a series of climate impacts. After the city had been plastered with ads from Coca-Cola to Siemens playing off the Copenhagen theme. After a huge sphere was erected in the city centre, swathed in high-tech Copenhagen messages. We'd moved from Copenhagen to Hypenhagen. And given the build-up, I had uneasy feelings that this was not going to end very well. All this hype was a mismatch with the reality of the preceding month's negotiations which made it very clear, even by early 2009, that no complete ratifiable treaty would be agreed in Copenhagen. It's important, if not now academic, though, to understand that the 2007 meeting in Bali, which had outlined the roadmaps to Copenhagen, did not agree to deliver a new legally binding agreement by then. Instead, the task was to achieve an agreed outcome, with no further clarification of what that outcome should be. It is important also to realise that Bali wasn't a triumph of diplomacy. It was a smash-em-up derby that just fell across the line, with trust reserves at very low levels indeed between the countries. So a new treaty may have been viewed as an optimal outcome from Copenhagen, but it was never guaranteed or even promised. In October last year, by which time it was well and truly clear that there would be no ratifiable treaty, the Climate Institute released a briefing paper concluding that the success of any agreed outcome should be judged on the achievement in 5 key areas. Firstly, climate security. Did it aim to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees, and importantly, to peak global pollution before 2020? Secondly, to legal form. Did it build on the Kyoto Protocol with commitment to finalise a new agreement before the conclusion of the Kyoto period in 2012? Thirdly, on finance, committing to urgent fast start, or pre-2012, mostly public investment in developing countries' mitigation and adaptation, with a focus on innovative and additional private market sources kicking in from then. Fourthly, on accountability and transparency, providing independent and internationally verification of mitigation, finance and carbon markets. And finally, it needed to be politically durable. It needed to broaden participation in legally binding but fair commitments with advancing developing countries, whilst also recognising that developed countries need to lead and to support in particular adaptation in the poorest and most vulnerable countries. Before Copenhagen, indeed, actually optimism built up as the US, followed by China, and then India, signalled that they were prepared to commit internationally to emissions targets. And even 2 days from the conclusion of the meeting, there were slender hopes alive amongst us at the meeting that much of these foundational elements could be achieved. As is the way in these and just about every other negotiation, the key cards, of course, were only finally put on the table as the deadline approached. Firstly, Australia, followed by other Kyoto developed countries, started to get off the fence about whether they would insist on a post-2012 single-track binding agreement, but they actually committed to a 2-track process for a few years where the Kyoto Protocol coexists with another track of commitments for advancing developing countries and the US, which of course never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. This second track does need to be strong enough though. If it is too weak, it will kill Kyoto, as others claimed of some in the Kyoto Club, as much as any other move by the Kyoto members. By encouraging members of, if it's too weak a second track, members of Kyoto will of course jump ship towards that weaker track with the lesser obligations, and so it is important that that had equal balance in some way. Secondly, China and later Brazil indicated that financing being called for from developed countries to developing countries didn't need to be directed at themselves, but they should be directed at other developing countries. This was vital for a US administration being circled by climate hawks, sharpening their talons at the prospect of an agreement that would see the US dollars going to finance the growth of competitors, particularly in China. Our very own hawks, Senators Joyce and Boswell, trotted out the same line with great predictability before and even after this important concession. Thirdly, and perhaps liberated by that commitment, and despite previously signalling that this was a red line for them in the talks, Hillary Clinton arrived and, in the context of a global agreement, stated that the US could support an aim of generating $100 billion a year by 2020 from the public and private sector financing. These developments, as well as solid progress in negotiations on deforestation and technology transfer, combined with rumours of an agreement between the US and China on independent verification, to quicken the pulses of those of us stalking the halls of Copenhagen. But not those of the closest negotiators. They remained fairly grim-faced around the organic apple carts of the Copenhagen Hall. For in reality, stronger geopolitical forces were at play. Now, much attention has been focused on the obstructionism of China and India as they appeared to relish the opportunity of standing eyeball to eyeball with the US. Signs of this new assertiveness had emerged throughout the meetings of negotiators throughout the year and in forums like the G20. Negotiators from developed countries struggle to pick the internal Chinese power plays and their implications for the Copenhagen talks. Positive comments from the Chinese Premier at the June G8 meeting never seemed to manifest themselves in actions at the G20 finance ministers' meetings or leaders' meetings closer to Copenhagen. Meanwhile, sabre-rattling comments from lead Chinese negotiators warning off those seeking international verification of Chinese domestic actions sparked an exuberant following in the Chinese blogosphere and domestic constituencies. Despite the fact that precedents already existed for external verification in WTO and nuclear agreements, this is very clearly a sensitive area for China. It's important to note that politicians always speak to their domestic audience, and it's no different in China. In that environment, our Chinese colleagues have to deal with two key challenges. The first is that a substantial part of the Chinese government, public and media, still believes that climate change is an excuse used by Western countries to slow down China's development. That he has such fellow travellers in communist China would no doubt come as a surprise to Nick Minchin, who in a similar vein thinks climate change is an anti-capitalist conspiracy dreamed up by ex-communists after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, this myth of a Western conspiracy exists not just in China. I was actually at a meeting upstairs with the Australia-India Council, where a former Indian lead negotiator expressed a very similar sentiment. I'm sure it's a card that's played by many opposing climate action in developing countries. The second key challenge in China is that while they've begun to construct a blueprint for its low-carbon economy, there's still a lack of confidence of how far that can go. There's every reason, including energy security, local environment protection, economic stimulation and clean technology market share, for the Chinese government to maintain its phenomenal current investment in low-carbon development. But before the Chinese government is confident the low-carbon model can really deliver the development it needs, China will continue to maximise its emission space in the international climate talks. This concern on a straight-out issue of equity was pivotal for China while accepting the 2-degree warming target, refusing to include a 2050 target of a 50% reduction of global emissions, and refusing to accept an 80% reduction in this time frame for developed countries. This latter refusal allegedly caused Kevin Rudd to bang the microphone in frustration and caused German Chancellor Angela Merkel to protest at the Chinese blocking developed countries setting their own targets. Now, while most Western media has concentrated on the new Chinese assertiveness and the apparent protocol snubs of Obama, I still haven't seen reported the fact that the Chinese government and others calculated that those targets, with those targets for developed countries, would see each person in developed countries still emitting some 2 to 6 times more per capita than those in developing countries. Now, the Climate Institute's view is it's inevitable that a broader range of indicators, including per capita contributions, will be used in defining who gets access to our shrinking atmospheric space. But the central point of equity was highlighted also by Garneau's review, is that achieving a per capita convergence by no later than 2050 would be crucial to any politically acceptable global agreement. And in fact, Garneau hailed the avoidance of the endorsement of those targets as actually a major achievement of what he called the Obama Accord. The Garneau review actually said a 90% target was more appropriate for developed countries as a fair share. Of course, you need to remember that the Rudd government at the moment has a 60% target by 2050. Tony Abbott's coalition doesn't have any 2050 target. The PM has spoken of seeking a new mandate for the 2050 target at the next election. And so it will be very important because anything less than 90% will be a direct snub to China and to building on the Copenhagen Accord. There's much more to the entrails of the Copenhagen meeting, but I want to pick up just one extra point. That's the fracturing and tearing of traditional negotiating blocs. Traditionally in climate negotiations there have been 3 major blocs: Europe, the umbrella group, and the developing country grouping known as the group of G77 and China. Europe consists of the EU, the umbrella group chaired by Australia, highlighting its influential middle power status, has the US, Russia, Canada, Japan, Norway, Ukraine and New Zealand. The G77 and China has represented most of the developing countries. This group's got some smaller subgroups such as OPEC and the Alliance of Small Island States. who take their own positions, but traditionally solidarity of this group has been paramount and ruthlessly caucused. Climate negotiations under the UNFCCC have pinballed between these three blocs. But over the last few years, they've shown wear and tear, and that those blocs have been weakening. The expansion of the EU into carbon-intensive economies such as Poland has taken some of the steam out of its zeal and effectiveness. The umbrella groups of leadership has been, and including also from the US, has been jolted by leaders who actually talk of stronger action. And of course, they were joined just before Copenhagen by a more ambitious Japanese leader. The tensions within the G77's broad but effective coalition really only started to spill over in Copenhagen. And while trying to, as much as possible, link back to G77, solidarity, a new grouping of Brazil, South Africa, India and China emerged. They're now called the BASIC group. The small island states, whilst fighting for their very survival, peeled off in different directions. Tuvalu surprised many with tough positions on process and fought formal adoption of the accord, contrasting with the president of the Maldives punching the air in glee when exhausted delegates, and some of them who were asleep, actually recognised the accord under the UNFCCC. Some African and small island states became increasingly anxious that the basic US tussle was stalling progress, as well as risking some of the income that might come to them from finance. And there were signs of unease about whether the basics would stick by the other developing countries should the right deal emerge. Within that mix, you've got also positive roles being played increasingly by Indonesia, Mexico and South Korea. And what we'll see from basic countries is still emerging, but at the talks, for example, President Lula has shown promising leadership and stunning those at the conference and those of us huddling around TV podiums, and indeed his own entourage, by announcing new initiatives and funding without any cabinet or any other approval from the podium. So the key uncertainty is whether these progressive tendencies amongst some of those blocs will win the day, or whether the basic grouping will just add extra complexity to the geopolitics. And amongst the talks there, of course, there was bad behaviour on both sides. We saw outrageous comments from the Sudanese G77 representative, matched with those from the US representative, adding substantial new rewrites of a negotiating text at 5 a.m. on the second last day. Trust reserves were pointing to empty. Adding to the temperature of these meetings, of course, is the fact that each of these blocs, or indeed any country, can technically at least halt the progress on any point under the consensus rules of the UNFCCC. This is often pointed to as a terminal flaw in the ability of the UNFCCC to drive and conclude the necessary agreements. Now, while there is evidence that this is a simplistic generalisation, I, for example, witnessed the US's remarkable capitulation under the white heat of the public gaze at Bali. There's no question that the UNFCCC is an unwieldy beast. And surfing above these old and new undercurrents was the leviathan in the water of the G2, US and China. And these two countries, more than any others, hold the power to sway the directions of climate talks. But there is another major problem stalking the talks, which was the lack of ambition. We can't ignore the fact that developed countries just didn't come there with sufficient ambition. The Bali roadmap referenced a requirement for some 25 to 40% reduction by 2020, but analysis showed that the best commitment was some 15% of those as a group. There are varying views around developing country commitments. Professor Garneau says that was their commitments on the table, levelled out, were fair enough for that 2 degrees. Others think that they still required more ambition. Before leaving Copenhagen, I think it also would be churlish not to recognise the very considerable efforts put in by both the PM and the Climate Change Minister, Penny Wong, in the lead up to and at the talks. In our wrap-up at the end, our judgment of Australia's position against the 5 tests gave them about 3.5 stars out of 5. A solid performance, but could have done better. But unfortunately, they've actually gone backwards, not forwards since then. But moreover, moving on from Copenhagen, it's important to understand it didn't send us backwards. It didn't take us forward as much as was hoped or hyped, but we didn't go backwards. The Bali roadmap was kept open. Kyoto was not killed. Discussions continue on Kyoto's next commitment period and on key areas of finance, technology and deforestation. Critically, the Accord's fragile steps forward include the maths. that we've moved from Kyoto's 25% of global pollution to around 80% underneath the Accord. And finally, in the lead up to and following Copenhagen, we've seen an unprecedented surge in domestic policy action. In the 4 months between October 2009 and January 2010, over 150 new domestic policies and measures were announced globally. In the shadows of Copenhagen, this January was a very extraordinary time. It was a time when those of us who'd slaved and sweated over the CPRS and Copenhagen decided we'd remind ourselves to our friends and family. And this created a vacuum into which sashayed colourful mavericks such as Lord Monckton and his cohorts, swinging gaily on various gates: Climate Gate, Glacier Gate, Africa Gate, Amazon Gate. Now, these gates certainly have revealed some poorly worded communications and transparency of some climate scientists, and they have led to welcome reviews of the IPCC process. But none of these gates open to substantial flaws in climate science, or even of the key documents released in 2007. There's no denying that all these controversies and public perceptions around the Copenhagen conference put a dent in public confidence on the science and put those urging climate action on the defensive. And as if to rub salt in the wound, the weather also threw up icy conditions and extensive snowfalls, seemingly unfortunately targeted on the capital cities in Europe, Washington and Beijing. I say this, in fact, because actually, according to the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, January was the 4th warmest on record. Do you remember Canada's struggles to make enough artificial snow to actually keep the Winter Olympics going? Anyway, swimming against the tide of all these things was a remarkable report from Deutsche Bank in January entitled Investing in Climate Change 2010, a Strategic Asset Allocation Perspective. This reported that a portfolio with significant climate investments had outperformed a benchmark portfolio over the last 3 to 5 years. This report, not from someone's ex-communists, said, climate change is not merely an investment sector that may hold future promise, it is a sector that has already delivered and is continuing to deliver. That is why we believe institutional investors should be shifting their asset allocation towards climate change. For fiduciary reasons, if no other, they should be seeking out this attractive source of what they call alpha, which I understand is market return. The report, though, was also notable for this analysis of the Accord. It said the Accord leaves us with a choice. We can decide the glass is half full or half empty. The majority of the analysis seems to be the latter, because there was not only was there no legally binding agreement, but not even an agreed global emissions reductions target. We, however, believe the glass is half full, largely because the coalition of those who want to take action expanded to key emerging markets: China, India, Brazil and South Africa, and the Copenhagen Accord was drafted by senior leaders of these 4 countries, plus the President of the United States. An unprecedented outcome in international negotiations, and one that provides an important foundation towards a more ambitious agreement based on this understanding. In the sober light of early 2010, a glass half full approach is all we can take. There's no point in despair. But there are, in fact, reasons for optimism.